Academic dishonesty is a serious offense, and we must set an example. Bryan, you are hereby expelled from this university. Bryan felt like the floor had been pulled from under him. Expelled? After all his years of hard work? His dreams of becoming a lawyer, gone in an instant. Bryan was a very smart boy. He was studying law at a big university. Everyone in his class knew him because he was always the best. No matter how hard the exams were, Bryan always got the highest marks. Bryan loved to read big law books. He spent hours in the library learning about different cases and laws. While other students played games or watched movies, Bryan was busy studying. His teachers liked him because he asked good questions and always had the right answers, and her mother and siblings were so proud of him. Bryan doesn't brag. He knew that being smart was not just about knowing answers. It was about thinking carefully and working hard. But Bryan had a secret. He was in love with a girl named Sandra, who was also studying law. Sandra was kind and beautiful, but she was struggling with her studies. No matter how hard she tried, she could not pass one of the most difficult law courses. When Bryan had finally reached his final year in school, he was still the top student, and everyone respected him. Professors praised him, students admired him. One day, Sandra came to Bryan with tears in her eyes. "Bryan, I failed my exam again," she said. "If I don't pass this time, I won't graduate with you." Bryan felt sad for her. He wanted to help. "Don't worry, Sandra, I will tutor you. We'll study together, and you will pass," he said. But Sandra shook her head. "I've tried so hard, but I just can't do it. Please, Bryan, I need your help. Just this one time. Can you rewrite the exam for me?" Bryan was shocked. "That's cheating, Sandra. If we get caught, I could be expelled." Sandra held his hands and looked into his eyes. "Please, Bryan, I can't fail again. Just this one time. No one will find out." Bryan knew it was wrong, but he also couldn't bear to see Sandra so sad. He had never cheated before, but this time he made a terrible decision. He agreed to write the exam for her. On the exam day, Sandra gave him her exam card and Bryan sat in her place. He knew all the answers, so he quickly started writing. Everything was going smoothly until a deep voice called his name. "Bryan?" He froze. Slowly, he looked up and saw Professor Adams, one of the strictest lecturers in the university, standing in front of him. "Stand up," the professor said, his eyes sharp. "Whose exam are you writing?" The whole class turned to look at Bryan. His hands felt cold. His heart was pounding. He had been caught. Bryan knew he had to think fast. He couldn't just admit to cheating. His whole future was at risk. "Sir, this is a misunderstanding," Bryan said, trying to stay calm. "I can explain." Professor Adams crossed his arms. "Then explain, Bryan. Why is Sandra's name on this exam paper when you are the one writing it?" Bryan swallowed hard. "Sandra was feeling unwell this morning. She was afraid she wouldn't be able to concentrate on the exam, so she asked me to write it for her. I only wanted to help." The professor's face remained serious. "Helping someone by cheating is still wrong, Bryan. You are the top student. You should know better." The class was silent. Some students whispered to each other, shocked that the best law student in the school had been caught cheating. Professor Adams shook his head. "This matter is too serious. You will have to face the school's Senate." Bryan felt a chill run down his spine. The Senate was the highest disciplinary body in the university. If they found him guilty, he could be expelled and all his years of hard work would be wasted. The next day, Bryan stood before the Senate. The vice-chancellor, the dean of law, and other top professors were seated in front of him. Sandra was also there, looking scared. The dean of law spoke first. "Bryan, you have been accused of academic dishonesty. Do you have anything to say in your defense?" Bryan took a deep breath. He had to be very careful with his words. His entire future depended on what he said next. Bryan stood before the school senate, his heart pounding. He knew he had made a mistake, but he still hoped for mercy. "I understand that what I did was wrong," he said, choosing his words carefully. "I was only trying to help Sandra, but I now realize that helping someone the wrong way is not true help at all. I take full responsibility for my actions." The vice-chancellor adjusted his glasses. "Bryan, you are an excellent student, but rules are rules. We cannot make exceptions, even for the best. Academic dishonesty is a serious offense, and we must set an example." The room was silent for a moment. Then the Dean of Law spoke. "After much deliberation, the Senate has made its decision. Bryan, you are hereby expelled from this university." Bryan felt like the floor had been pulled from under him. Expelled? After all his years of hard work? His dreams of becoming a lawyer, gone in an instant. He turned to Sandra, hoping she would also take responsibility. But to his shock, she stood up and said, "I had no idea Bryan was writing the exam for me. I never asked him to do it." Bryan's eyes widened. "Sandra, what are you saying?" One of the professors turned to her. "So, you are saying you did not plan this with Bryan?" Sandra nodded quickly. "No, sir. I was unwell that day, and I was surprised when I heard that Bryan had written my exam. I would never ask someone to do such a thing." Bryan couldn't believe what he was hearing. Sandra was lying to save herself. After a short discussion, the Senate announced their verdict. Since there is no proof that Sandra was involved, she will not be expelled. However, she will have to rewrite the exam under supervision. Bryan felt a deep pain in his chest. Not only had he lost everything, but the person he risked everything for had betrayed him. As he walked out of the Senate hall, students whispered and stared at him. He was no longer Bryan, the top law student. He was now Bryan, the student who had been expelled. With his dreams shattered and nowhere to go, Bryan stepped out of the university gates, wondering what he would do next. When Bryan's mother heard the news, she sat down in shock. Her hands trembled as she held the letter from the university confirming his expulsion. "No, this can't be," she whispered, tears filling her eyes. She had worked so hard to support Bryan's education. After his father passed away, she became both mother and father to him. She took extra shifts at work, skipped meals to save money, and made sure he had everything he needed. She had dreamed of the day she would see him graduate as a lawyer. But now, all of that was gone. Bryan sat quietly, unable to look at her. "Mama, I'm so sorry," he said in a low voice. His mother wiped her tears and looked at him. "Bryan, why? You have always been a smart and honest boy. How could you throw everything away like this?" "I thought I was helping someone I cared about," he said, his voice heavy with regret. "I didn't think I would get caught." She shook her head. "Helping someone should never cost you your future, my son." The pain in her eyes was worse than any punishment the university could have given him. Bryan felt like he had failed not just himself, but the person who had sacrificed everything for him. To make things worse, his mother was to retire from work. Their financial situation was already difficult, and now, without a degree, Bryan had no idea how he would ever get a good job. His mother took a deep breath. "You have made a mistake, Bryan. But mistakes are not the end. You must find a way to fix this." Bryan wiped his tears and nodded. As he sat in his small room that night, he started thinking. There had to be a way to start again. Years passed and Sandra finally graduated from law school. She became a lawyer, just like she had always dreamed. She got a good job at a big law firm, and soon her life was filled with success. She never looked back at Bryan or thought about what had happened to him. But Bryan's life was very different. After his expulsion, no law school wanted to accept him, and no company wanted to hire him. His dreams of becoming a lawyer had disappeared, and he struggled to find his place in the world. At first, he applied for office jobs, but every time employers saw his records, they rejected him. They didn't want to hire someone who had been expelled for cheating. With no options left, Bryan had to take menial jobs just to survive. He worked as a cleaner, a construction worker, and sometimes as a delivery man. It was not the life he had imagined, but he refused to give up. Even though life was hard, Bryan remained a good man. He worked honestly and never blamed anyone for his situation. One day while walking on the road, he met a woman named Anita. She was kind, hardworking, and full of life. Unlike others, she did not judge Bryan for his past. Instead, she saw his intelligence, his kindness, and his determination. Anita and Bryan became close. She encouraged him not to give up on his dreams, even though life had been unfair to him. Over time, their friendship grew into love, and soon they got married. Even though they did not have much, Anita stood by Bryan's side. She believed that one day he would find a way to succeed again. One evening, after a long day of work, Bryan sat outside his small house thinking. He knew he couldn't do menial jobs forever. There had to be a way to use his intelligence, even without a law degree. Then, an idea formed in his mind. Bryan wanted to start his own business, maybe something small, like a shop or a tutoring center where he could teach young students about law. But no one wanted to help him. He went to banks for loans, but they refused because of his past. He reached out to old friends from university, but they either ignored him or made excuses. Even people he had once helped turned their backs on him. Sandra, who was now a successful lawyer, pretended not to know him when he tried to speak to her one day. She had moved on with her life and wanted nothing to do with her past. With no other choice, Bryan continued doing menial jobs, carrying loads at construction sites, cleaning offices, and sometimes even begging for work just to feed his family. Years passed, and Bryan and Anita had 2 children. Life was hard. There were days they had nothing to eat, and nights when they slept hungry. Bryan worked from morning until night, but the little money he earned was never enough. Still, he never gave up hope. Every night, he would sit with his children and tell them stories, reminding them to always be honest and work hard. He dreamed that one day, they would have the opportunities he had lost. Even though no one helped him, Bryan kept believing. He looked at his children's faces and whispered to himself, "One day, things will get better."